Welcome to our session today, where we're going to talk about purposeful practical activities in science. My name's Kathleen and I'm the head of Science Mastery. Please have your mic off during the session. If you've got any general questions for our Q&A at the end, just pop them in the chat and we'll collate as we go. And this will be interactive and I will ask you to respond in the chat. So it'd be wonderful if you could be ready to share your experiences and your expertise. And we will record this session if you did want to share with other colleagues. So I'd like you now, just for 1 minute, jot down privately the top 3 things that you consider when planning a practical activity. I'm going to start my timer. Another 10 seconds. Thank you. And then that little chart on the right, if you just think about where your own practice is at the moment with regards to planning purposeful practical work, just have a think about where you would sort of judge yourself, whether you are currently, in the position of producing good practice or average, or whether you'd like to make some changes. Okay, before we go on and do a bit more reflection of what we do and sharing experiences, I'm just going to bring it back down to some sort of basics around what do we mean by practical and inquiry skills. Because if we're going to talk about purposeful practical work, it's really important that we consider these things. And making progress in science does depend on students knowing more and remembering more about both the substantive knowledge and the disciplinary knowledge. And as a recap of things you probably read about before, but substantive knowledge is, those bits of knowledge that make up science. For example, the heliocentric model of the solar system, or the features of a plant, for example. Whereas disciplinary knowledge refers to what pupils need to know about how science establishes and refines scientific knowledge. It's not as simple as being simply a skill, like drawing a graph, but it could be things like understanding variables and different types of measurement. But substantive knowledge isn't the same thing as knowing, and disciplinary knowledge isn't the same thing as skills or doing. Actually, there's a sort of more nuanced and complicated sort of interplay between substantive knowledge and disciplinary knowledge when we're talking about practical skills. And just to break that down further, if we think of a scientific skill, like using a thermometer to measure temperature, we know that that is a composite. And that composite is made up of smaller components of disciplinary knowledge and sometimes substantive knowledge. So I'm going to pause for a second and let you think, what do students actually need to know or be able to do to use a thermometer to measure the temperature of a solution? There's actually a lot of things. So that's the composite skill. And in Science Mastery and in science in general, when we're teaching, we talk about skills, don't we? That is the composite, but it's made up of so many components. For example, how to hold the thermometer. Don't put it in upside down, for example, if it's a liquid. What does measurement mean? What are the units of temperature and how do I write that down? What's repeatability? Do I need to repeat this measurement? Etc., etc. And there's lots of things that build into a skill. And this is why we need to think carefully when doing practical work and introducing a skill or a component of a skill. And linked to that, I just want to do a sort of more broad overview of, well, why do we do practical work then? Because that sounds quite tricky, doesn't it? Getting students to engage properly with what skills are and to be able to teach them all those components to be able to perform that skill. But it is really important. And I'm going to refer here to the Gatsby report about good practical science, which if you want some extra reading, it's a really interesting report where they studied great practical work in science lessons across the world in different contexts, and came up with 5 key purposes of practical work. And we're not going to say here, because the spec tells us we have to do required practicals. We're talking about the discipline and the subject of science and why it's so important at secondary school and primary, but we're focusing on secondary here. Why is it so important to do practical work? And the first one there, A, is probably the one most of you would think comes to mind first: to teach the principles of scientific inquiry. It's much easier to teach that in context, where there's an actual practical question in front of you that you're investigating. The second one is to improve understanding of theory through practical experience. And when I was writing this webinar, what came to mind was when I was still teaching, thinking about that lovely practical where you're comparing different metals and comparing their reactivity with hydrochloric acid. Now, you can look at that on the board or on a worksheet and look at the different number of bubbles, but actually getting the students to do that practical and hear the fizzing, feel the different temperatures of the test tubes, that really can help them consolidate that theoretical understanding through the practical hands-on experience. The third one is for those practical skills that I just mentioned with, for example, the thermometer. So measuring the temperature is so much easier for students to learn in that practical context rather than the teacher telling them, or rather than reading about it, of course. But why is it purposeful? Well, it's going to be useful if they do want to do further study, or it could be useful for other practical reasons, for example, different types of employment. D, I'm sure as science teachers, we've all experienced this one when you get those eager year 7s at your door saying, we're doing a practical today, miss, we're doing a practical. There's some students that absolutely love it, and we do not want to extinguish that love of practical science. We want to keep it alive, to motivate them and engage them with what is sometimes, really tricky conceptual areas of science. Then, the final one is to develop higher level skills. And this is one that we often miss out. So skills and attributes like communication, teamwork, and perseverance. And one that comes to mind from my own experience was when students are trying to build a parallel circuit and they've got all the components and the wires in front of them, and watching them from afar, having to persevere. And the bulb's not coming on and they've got to figure out what's happened here. Am I putting the wires in the wrong place? Is the battery not working? Practicals like that are developing so many other skills, not just the above, as in, we've got to learn about current and voltage in parallel circuits, but teamwork as well. It's such a wonderful thing when you can assign different roles to a group of 3 for your practical work. And you can see students shine when they are leading the team or they're collecting the equipment, and giving them responsibilities like that can be really developmental and valuable for those students. So hopefully I've convinced you, with the support of the Gatsby report, that practical work can be so purposeful and useful when done well. And that's what the rest of this session is going to be about, is what makes it good and effective. So I'm going to show you a short clip now from a previous Ofsted inspector who led on science. And he's going to share with us some observations of where he's seen really effective practical work and ineffective practical work. And we'll write our thoughts in the chat afterwards. So I hope any colleagues on the call will be able to tell me if this doesn't work, but I'm hoping it will work well.
My name is a lesson, a double lesson.
Okay, so the first section is an example of effective practical work. It'd be good actually if you could think about your own experiences and observations of good, effective practical work.
I have vivid memories of a lesson, a double lesson in a North Derbyshire secondary school with year 8 pupils. The preceding 2 double lessons, the young people had been researching the impact of acid rain on limestone. They had came up with a hypothesis for their group themselves. They designed the experiment, they carried it out, they'd captured the data, and each group had captured the data in tabular form on their laptops for their group. When I arrived, the last group was giving a PowerPoint presentation of their findings, a very persuasive presentation by a Year 8 young woman, who, when she finished, was invited by the classroom teacher to stay at the front, to use the teacher's laptop, the interactive whiteboard, and he simply said to the rest of the class, as we said last time, let's all put our data up on the screen in turn and have a look at what each group has found. And the child, the Year 8 pupil, did that ICT job and put the data on the board. Well, the level of these young people being gripped by what they saw appearing on the whiteboard and applying themselves to it as scientists was magnificent. Straight away, hands were shooting up and they were wanting to talk about anomalous data that they could see. And they were comparing it with their own thoughts. And this very rich discussion went on about what factors might have affected different bits of data. And throughout the whole session, the level of motivation, of application, of engagement was sky high.
Okay, so now I'd like you to write in the chat. Will it let me click forward without starting the video? Yep. I'll wait for a couple of minutes. Could you please write in the chat what you think the features of effective practical work are? Thank you. There's so many great responses here. Participation, high pupil engagement, building on existing skills. That's a really good one. There's actually learning happening. That sounds obvious, doesn't it? But, you know, sometimes there might not be learning going on. Driving curiosity, a well-planned. That's really perceptive. Yeah, that's so true. All the planning that goes behind it. You can't underestimate that. And again, we'll talk about that a bit later on, some ideas of planning practical work. So many great things coming in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Critical thinking as well, linking theory to real life and problem solving. Now, in an ideal world, all of our practicals would be like that, but we know that there are other challenges that we face in making practical work really effective. Okay, so we're going to move on now and listen to the next section, which is the observation of poor practice. And again, please reflect on perhaps your own experiences and things you've observed of ineffective practical work.
One example of poor practice that I saw was with a Year 7 class, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, keen young people going into the laboratory, and the topic being explored seemed to be, well, it was expressed by the teacher as about macerating beetroot. Now, the blank expression that came onto the faces of some of the young people would have, from an active teacher, elicited some sort of explanatory note, but I'm afraid there wasn't. The teacher issued canary yellow worksheets that gave them how to bash their beetroot, what to do. It contained vocabulary that some of the young people clearly did not understand. And there were gaps in the canary yellow worksheets where the expectation of teacher was that the pupils would put in the keyword required. My eyes fell upon one particular young Year 7 girl who really did seem to quite enjoy bashing her beetroot. But when it came to filling in the gaps, she turned to her neighbour to ask what word should go here. And when her neighbour didn't know, she asked teacher. And teacher, without having any dialogue with this student at all, told her the word to put in. And I followed this young girl out of the lesson with a few of her friends and just talked to them briefly about what they'd learned. And while, as I say, she clearly enjoyed bashing her beetroot, she didn't retain any scientific understanding of the procedures that had gone through, or what conclusions could be drawn from it, and why they'd done it. The teacher, sadly, was an NQT who thought she was following instructions, but there had been no dialogue with the head of science as to the real purposes of the exercise and what the outcomes should have been and how she could have helped the young people to get to the outcomes. So, you know, that was practical work, but it wasn't good and it was fruitless.
Okay, following up from that then, another couple of minutes in the chat. Can you please write down what you think the features of ineffective practical work? You can take inspiration from that beetroot example as well. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, someone's put about no conceptual understanding. That really, and the lack of context that someone said as well, means that it wasn't purposeful, was it? Difficult vocabulary, no clear instructions. And you probably expect that teacher hadn't done any sort of checking of prior knowledge to see, do the students really know what we're doing here, that we're extracting a liquid that could be used as an indicator because we're learning about acids and alkalis. And, you know, it sounds like none of that was done. And we can put that down, as I can see in the chat. A lot of you are saying no preparation and that it's been rushed. And again, I'm trying to hit home here that that's down to poor planning. And I know there's hardly any time in the day to dedicate to effective planning, but hopefully as the session goes on, we can discuss quick fire ways to make sure that practical work is purposeful. Okay, moving on then. Now, I don't always want to link things to Ofsted, but we do need to consider what happens if an Ofsted inspector, that it might be deep diving science, they visit a practical lesson. And if you consider the two extremes we just talked about, what questions are Ofsted going to ask when they watch your practical lesson? Please put your ideas in the chat. So we're looking for questions that Ofsted are thinking about when looking at practical work. Thank you. I can see there questions about why are we doing the practical? That, again, that's coming down to purpose. Alex, thank you. You've hit the nail on the head there, and I'm going to go on to this about fitting into curriculum intent. You must be able to articulate the curriculum intent and where that particular practical falls within that. A lot of people are talking about skills, great, because you want to make sure that either they have the skills or you've taught the disciplinary knowledge components beforehand so they can develop skills. Meeting learning objective. I can see, Karen, you've written about prior learning. Yeah, all this feeds into it. Thank you. I'm going to move on now. So if we think about intent, these are questions that were shared by the previous head of science at Ofsted. So these, I haven't invented these based on my knowledge. It's literally what they will be thinking about, in the words of a previous head of science inspector. Firstly, what's the purpose of the practical relation to curriculum intent? That was said in the chat. Amazing. This one's about the sequencing of that curriculum intent. What came before this lesson and what comes after? Like with the beetroot example, I would love to ask that teacher, what came before this? And you can start to unpick and question, you know, could it have been different or been set up in a different way? And what comes after? Earlier, someone mentioned that you leave time after the experiment to do some analysis. And that's great. If you can plan that in to sort of wrap up, consolidate, or even extend what was done in the practical, then that can be very powerful as well. When we think about implementation, questions will be, can pupils connect theory to what they're doing? If they're looking at those 4 different metals in test tubes with different amounts of bubbling, do they know what that is? Do they know what reactivity is? Do they know what the reactivity series is? It's all about connecting it back to theory. Do the teaching materials and the tasks support that intent? So is the activity appropriate or not? And is assessment used well? And I don't just mean, you know, a summative assessment at the end of term. By that, what's meant is the formative assessment that you're doing all the time. And for impact, what do pupils know at this point? What can they do in terms of their skills? Do pupils know more, remember more, and able to do more as a result of this practical? Now, within our Science Mastery programme, we've thought really carefully about this because we want to provide all the tools to be able to, answer these tricky questions. So you need to have a curriculum framework that outlines which knowledge and skills are being taught and when across your 5 years, 7 to 11. We've also decided on 100 practical inquiry and math skills that are mapped against this framework. So when you're first teaching graph plotting, when you're doing it second and third time in an appropriate context to the intent of the unit. With implementation, now largely, that's my first green bullet point, it is achieved through that thoughtful lesson preparation. And a lot of the comments have come back to that, the planning, the preparation you do before you teach. But to support that, we can give suggested activities and write out formative assessment activities so that you're getting that check for understanding before you proceed with bashing the beetroot practical, for example. And finally, when you're thinking about what do they know, that could be done by a summative assessment at the end of the year, or it could be questioning in lessons or some written output in books, observing student competency. Can they actually measure the temperature of this solution? And you can observe that. And again, I've put the formative and summative assessment there. Okay, so I'm going to sum up now a lot of the things we've discussed so far so that we can really sort of pinpoint in terms of pedagogy, what do you need to consider when planning purposeful practical work? Now, we haven't talked about this a lot, but I think it's come through in the chat. And actually from the that lead inspectorate's video, clear teacher expectations are key. The students must know, and I don't just mean a practical sense of, that bucket is for the dirty test tubes and you're collecting your batteries and your wires from here, but expectations around the thinking of what you want them to actually be doing. During this practical, you will be recording data on X, for example. Otherwise, it loses its purpose and it just becomes a farcical, sometimes fun activity. So clear expectations, enough prior knowledge for it to be useful. Just going back to that reactivity of metals practical, it might not be as powerful if you haven't done all the prior knowledge teaching beforehand about the reactivity series and even what metals are and all the other prior knowledge required to access that particular investigation. And like we're saying with the Ofsted expectations, what's the purpose of this practical in relation to curriculum intent? You've got to think, what am I teaching across the unit? What am I teaching within this lesson? What's the knowledge? What are the knowledge points? What are the skills? Does this practical sit with that or not? Does it support that or not? And forming part of a wider instructional sequence. So making sure this is linked to the prior knowledge, but what comes next? Are you going to do another practical later on that builds on that? Or are you moving on to something different, applying it in a different way perhaps, but making sure that in the bigger picture, that this practical should be taught here in the sequence? And explicitly teaching disciplinary knowledge. And like I said earlier with the thermometer example, you can't just demo it and expect them to go and do it. You have to explain through a lot of other, teaching and activities, what the bits of disciplinary knowledge are. For example, how do you measure things and why? What are the units of temperature, etc.? So what we've done in our central team is figure out, well, what would be a useful way to use all of that research and that advice from Ofsted and all of our experiences to ensure that planning is done in a purposeful way. And we've come up with 6 quick questions that you can run through in a sort of flowchart fashion to think about whether this practical is purposeful or not. And the sheer thinking through this is part of your intellectual preparation and your planning to make that practical as effective as it can be. So we're going to briefly describe these. And a bit later in the chat, someone in the team is going to post the link. So if you'd like to download a document with more support around what this flowchart means, you can download it from that link. So the first question you should ask is this practical activity appropriate? Will it achieve my intended outcomes? And that's linking back to our curriculum intent. If the answer is yes, it will, go to question 2, which is, well, where in the sequence of learning should it be? Is it in the right place currently? Then the third question would be, well, what's the most important elements of this practical activity? Because I'm sure, as many of you have experienced, you can't actually achieve 5 different skills practice in one practical. It becomes overwhelming for teacher and students. So it might be that you want them to write down their observations, comparing the reactivity of metals, and it's about observing and writing down a qualitative statement about their observations. That might be the focus, or it might be, I want to reinforce the theory, so I'm going to give them some more questions to test their understanding of reactivity. The fourth one is about adapting to the needs of the students in your class. So that one really is only down to the classroom teacher themselves, who knows the students better than anyone. I think about, okay, well, I've got a child there who will need more help with literacy. They've got a really low reading age, and so I'm going to print out some integrated instructions, which are images that show how we're going to do the practical. The fifth one, again, pertains to that video where the bashing beetroot didn't have any purpose. You want to make sure students are brains on as well as hands on, because you can walk into a classroom and all 30 students are very busy doing their practical, but are they actually thinking about what they're doing? And finally, what's the output of this? How will you know that the students have achieved the intended outcome? It might be as simple as, I've got 3 exit ticket questions that I'll do in the last minute of the lesson, and it'll give me a picture of whether the students really grasped the most important element of this practical. Okay, so that's a whiz through the flow chart for planning practical activities that we've designed. To apply that, we're going to do a mini task. I'd like you to put your answers in the chat. So I've put the 6 questions on the right-hand side, and I'd like you to be ready to write numbers 1 to 6 in the chat when I share with you a common practical pitfall. Because what we're going to do is figure out which of those questions and those preparation activities would have helped the teacher to avoid the practical pitfall. So teacher A says, students don't know why we're doing the practical, but I've explained it already. In the chat, be ready to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Which of those would have helped that teacher avoid that problem? I'm looking forward to seeing what everyone thinks. All right, we've got mostly 2s, a few 1s. Excellent. I definitely agree. It's a 1 and a 2 question. It's probably not appropriate for those students if they don't understand as to why they're doing it. And maybe it's in the wrong place in the sequence of learning. So I fully agree. Thank you for that input. Right, let's try another one. Teacher B says, students took so long to set up the experiment that they never get to collect the results to analyse, when the data analysis was the most important part. Again, please, 1 to 6, which question would have supported teacher B? I've got more of a mixed bag here. When we initially wrote this, I was thinking 3, because, and a lot of you have said 3, but also I agree, 4 is also pertinent here. Because for 3, if the most important element was data analysis, then something's gone wrong there. Question 3 hasn't been considered. The teacher might have said, right, this lesson's focused on data analysis, but they didn't plan the lesson appropriately, because they should have jotted down timings perhaps and said, right, set up the experiment for 10 minutes because the following 30 after we've collected the results is about analysis. Okay, we'll do a couple more. These are fun. Teacher C says most students completed the practical, but I'm not sure how much they really understood. All right, the results are coming in. So we're getting lots of 5s and 6s. Lovely. Yeah, I definitely agree. If you haven't done 6, which is your check for understanding at the end, how are you ever going to know how much they understood? You have to carefully think about the end point, what's your intended outcome, and how are you going to check for that? You can't just send them on their way and assume, oh, great, they really understood why we were extracting a solution from beetroot. unless you actually check understanding. I think there's a D. Is there a D? Yes. Right. Final one. I just said this one. I asked my students what the practical was about, and they said mashing up beetroot. What question would support that teacher? I do agree, there's some 5s there as well. I do agree that 5 is also really important for that one, because clearly the student that the Ofsted inspector talked to, she wasn't brains on at all. She was just enjoying the practical work. We've got actually a couple of 2s as well. Sequence of learning. Actually, yeah, that does make sense, because if it's not in the right place in that unit, say you do it at the beginning of the unit before you know what indicators are, or acids and alkalis, perhaps. Or say you're using it to do chromatography on. Could have been anything, that practical. If you do it at the start and there's no setup and there's no appropriate prior knowledge and sequencing, then they won't know what they're doing. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for your input on that. I hope you found that useful. Whoops. So what we're going to do now, just as our final bit, I'm just going to pause for 4 minutes and just please reflect on what you like about that flowchart approach. And Elaine, if you're there, can you please post in the chat the link to that document, the flowchart document, so people can refer to it. I'd like you to think about how it might improve practical lessons and outcomes for your students. And the second reflection question is about any barriers or challenges that you anticipate in embedding this process into your own practice. So I'll pause for a few minutes before moving on while you jot down your reflections. Thank you. Thank you. I can see some of you are sharing your reflections in the chat. That's wonderful. Really appreciate that. Julian, you asked to put the chart back up. There's a link just above where you should be able to download it as a PDF. I would agree that it is good for new teachers. The full thing is really helpful for new teachers as they get to grips with planning practical work. So perhaps if you're a more experienced teacher, you might cut some of those out, and some of these questions will be more important than others. I should wait another 30 seconds while people finish their reflections. I've just posted the link again. Planning time is an issue. Completely agree. So many schools I visited recently have issues with retaining science teachers and staffing issues more generally, meaning that more teachers are having to do cover and teach more than they should be. So there's less time for planning. So I fully appreciate that it's a luxury to be able to have enough time to think through these 6 questions. And perhaps it is more of an ECT, less experienced teacher, their responsibility to do this. But I hope that some of these questions have prompted your thinking about perhaps the next practical that you're teaching. Okay then, so if you would like some further reading, I referred to the Gatsby report earlier about good practical science. It's quite lengthy, but you can dip in and out because it's actually very interesting to see where they did all the different studies. And there's a shorter article there by Emma Woodley, which you can download. Just Google it, it's online somewhere, about why practical work in school science is so important. And there's further references in there if you'd like to read that. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to my colleague who's going to talk a bit more about who we are, what even is science mastery, and why are we talking about practical work, for example. And I'll just check the chat for any other questions before I say bye. Oh, folder empty. Oh dear. Okay. What I'll do while my colleague Elaine is talking is I'll make a fresh link and allow access for all, and hopefully you can download it from there.
Perfect. Thank you, Kathleen. So I'm just going to talk to you and give you a bit more information about our Science Mastery Programme in general. So everything Kathleen has spoken about today is part of our Science Mastery Programme. Science Mastery is a complete curriculum programme from Art Curriculum Plus, and what that means is that it's a fully sequenced, evidence-informed curriculum that enables your teachers to teach the subject very well. And by signing up to be a partner school, you can then get access to this brilliant fully resourced curriculum, and then in line with that, you'll get an integrated assessment model and also subject-specific development and training. So what does this actually look like? Well, the fully resourced, fully sequenced curriculum gives you everything that you need to teach effectively. So that's a curriculum map which focuses on the 14 big ideas in science. It's cumulative and knowledge rich. So every year you're building on that knowledge and skills that you've learnt in your previous years. Of course, this is informed by the best evidence, and it's been trialled in classrooms so that we know that it's helping pupils to make that maximum progress. Alongside that sequencing, you get every single PowerPoint that you need to be able to teach this. These are fully downloadable and editable to allow you to teach great lessons within your classrooms. As I said, alongside that is a built-in assessment model, both formative and summative. Every lesson is packed full of formative assessments, whether that's a do now or an exit ticket or quick checks to check the whole class understanding. We also have end of unit assessments and pre-unit assessments using diagnostic multiple choice questions, ensuring that you know any misconceptions that your students may have and act to close those gaps as quickly as possible. Alongside that, we also have our termly formative assessments, as well as, of course, our annual summative assessments. As I said, it's not just about that curriculum, it's about empowering your teachers to teach the curriculum as well as possible. And to enable that to happen, we have on-demand professional development that can be accessed at any time via our online platform. But we also allow schools to have access to our development leads who can come in and give advice and help with that implementation and that development of the curriculum. And then this helps schools prioritize the highest impact changes and implement a new curriculum with ease. So we know that implementing a new curriculum is a big commitment, so we can help you through a journey to get there. So this journey will look a little bit like what's on the screen right now. In that first year, we would call it your launch year of a curriculum. And then in this year, this is where you empower your teachers and your leaders with this new subject knowledge, the pedagogy, and then the principles that they need to make this curriculum a success. And then after that launch year, you move into what we call your development years. And this is where teachers understand what the intent of this is and why, and are implementing it well, but then also really starting to build that practice in the classroom, develop that pedagogy to ensure that every single pupil is getting that amazing classroom practice and education. And then once we've developed this program, we'll get it to an amazing place in the school, and then we continue making small incremental improvements to make sure that we're constantly improving and adapting to meet the needs of every single pupil within the classroom. So if science mastery is something that you feel that your school would be interested in getting involved in, there's quite a few ways to get in touch with us. You can either drop us an email at partnerships@artcurriculumplus.org.uk, or you can scan that QR code or type in the shortened link at the bottom of the screen. Or if you'd like to speak to one of the team about it a little bit more and see a bit of a demo of what we actually do and the offering of the full curriculum program, you can also do that. Now is an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have, whether it's about anything Kathleen spoke about or anything to do with the curriculum as a whole. You can either type it in the chat or unmute yourself and fire away.
There's a question in the chat about cost, Elaine.
Sorry, my thing is not showing the chat. So costing, it varies. So we have 3 different packages, 3 different tiers. It's essentially the same core product between the 3 tiers, but what varies is the level of support that you receive as a partner school. So what you can do is, if you either book in a call or drop an email, what we can do is then go through which particular package would probably be most suitable for your school, and then we can discuss pricing based off of that.
I'm still about to work out how to upload that document with the flowchart on. So give me another 30 seconds and I'll upload it.
The curriculum right now is solely a Key Stage 3 curriculum. And yes, it is a 3-year curriculum. So it's all the way from year 7 through to year 9. So yeah, for now, it's currently a Key Stage 3 curriculum.
But I'd like to add that we are currently piloting our Key Stage 4 programme. So Elaine's right, we don't currently have it available to subscribe to, but we're piloting in all ARC schools for year 10 at the moment, and we're still writing year 11 with our internal team, and eventually we'll have all 5 years available, but at the minute it's just Key Stage 3. Catherine, you've said that could it be adapted for a 2-year Key Stage 3? So the idea of science mastery is that all the knowledge is mapped out over 5 years. It's from 7 to 11. So you couldn't just take year 7 and 8 and sort of have that in a bubble, if you like, and change it, because what comes in year 9 builds on those key concepts, sort of weaving through the big ideas throughout the 5 years. So there is some content that will be examined at GCSE that begins to be introduced in year 9 so that we can spread out knowledge appropriately over the 5 years. So I hope that that makes sense. I can see another question I want to answer. It's stopping me from uploading this PDF, but I'll do it in a second. Pooja, you've asked how, for Key Stage 3, how does the ARC curriculum vary from Key Stage 3 Activate? So from what I know about Activate, we haven't mapped our curriculum against Activate, and we have, well, I assume we have different names for units and everything. But what I can say is that our Key Stage 3 curriculum covers the national curriculum, which I know Activate and Caboodle also does. So in terms of what the actual curriculum content and your curriculum intent would be, I don't think there'd be any differences compared to national curriculum. But I think what we do have that's unique is our sequencing that goes across the 5 years, so that we make sure that you're revisiting these big ideas of science and really practicing those key concepts and practicing linking the interconnected bits of knowledge across biology, chemistry and physics.
I can see someone's asked for a minimum mastery price. So it will vary on the size of your school, but on average, if you were to opt for our least supportive package, which is called our mastery tier, which includes that fully resourced curriculum, the integrated assessment model, as well as the integrated professional development, it would come at a cost of around 2,600, and that's an annual subscription. So we follow a subscription based model. So every year you would have the option of renewing, but for 1 year, prices do start around 2,600 for our least supportive package. But then again, it does vary dependent on the size of your school. So with the biggest package, I assume you mean our most supportive package. We call that our tailored package. So like I mentioned earlier, we have 3 different packages. Our least supportive is called our mastery. We've got our middle package called our leadership, and the most supportive is our tailored. And with that tailored package, you get 6 touch points throughout the year. This means that you get assigned a development lead who would work alongside your school to offer those touch points, 2 of which will be face-to-face and 4 will be virtual. And these touch points would be bespoke to your school. So it can be anything ranging from Ofsted prep to forward planning to team training sessions on particular things that your staff need the most. But like I said, it would be between you and your development lead to sort that out. But that's essentially what you'd get in that tailored package. You'd get those 6 touch points, 2 of which are face-to-face and 4 virtual.
Can I add as well that if you're interested in seeing more of, what all our resources look like, you can contact our teams that Elaine shared earlier to get a sample pack. So all the things that we're talking about, all these great resources, you can see for yourself in a small sample, sort of to look at them, see what you get.